This week on The Inside Story, two nations at war, both reliant on U.S. aid and mired in political debate. From disease to homelessness and hunger, humanitarian groups warn the crisis in Gaza will only worsen as Israel steps up attacks on Hamas. Plus, Ukraine's president visits Washington in a push for more aid in his country's fight against Russia. Now, on The Inside Story, fighting on two fronts.
Welcome to The Inside Story. I'm Jessica Drury, VOA's Press Freedom Editor. This week we're focused on two conflicts, one involving Russia and Ukraine, the other Israel and Gaza. At the United Nations here in New York, the world continues to grapple with the aftermath of the October 7 Hamas terror attack on Israel and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. And in Washington, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky is lobbying the White House and lawmakers for more military aid in his country's fight against Russia. With heavy fighting in Gaza, humanitarian organisations warn of a growing crisis. Palestinians say 85% of the population are internally displaced, and the World Health Organization warns of a growing crisis posed by disease. VOA's Linda Gradstein starts us off this week from Jerusalem.
The humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip is growing increasingly dire, according to aid organizations working there. They say they have stopped much of their aid distribution efforts in southern Gaza because Israeli airstrikes and ground operations aimed at Hamas make it too dangerous.
The severe restrictions on aid access and delivery have only aggravated the situation, leading to starvation among Gaza's population and intensifying an already dire humanitarian crisis. Critical shortages of food, water, electricity, and fuel persist. In overcrowded shelters, scarcity of these items heightens health risks.
Medical professionals say the healthcare system is collapsing, and there are concerns about disease spreading, especially among an estimated 1 million children.
Hundreds of children lining up for a single toilet in the south. Our teams are telling us of maggots being picked from wounds and children undergoing amputations without anesthetic. More than 1 million children, practically all of the child population of Gaza, is left with nowhere to go as ground operations continue to expand in the south.
Israeli officials say they are doing whatever they can to allow humanitarian aid to reach those who need it. They are opening another terminal at the Kerem Shalom border crossing to speed up the Israeli inspections of the aid, which is done to prevent weapons smuggling.
In Nitzana, we expanded the capabilities, the inspections, and we accelerated the process. Today, we can inspect up to 250 trucks every day in Nitzana. And as I said, the problem is not Nitzana. The problem is the capability of the UN agencies to collect all the international assistance that, after we are checking it, goes to Rafah.
More than 18,000 Palestinians have been killed in the fighting and almost 50,000 wounded, according to the Hamas-controlled Palestinian Health Authority in Gaza. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has repeatedly called for a ceasefire.
Expect public order to completely break down soon. And an even worse situation could unfold, including epidemic diseases and increased pressure for mass displacement into Egypt.
Egypt is said to be reinforcing the wall it built on its border with Gaza. It has warned Israel and the international community that it will not accept any Palestinian refugees, leaving them to face the winter in a war zone. Linda Gradstein, VOA News, Jerusalem.
The US on Friday vetoed a UN Security Council resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. That decision attracted widespread criticism. VOA's Patsy Witakosara has more.
Another market destroyed in Gaza, this one in the Jabalia refugee camp. The level of civilian casualties is making U.S. President Joe Biden increasingly concerned.
We have made it clear to the Israelis, and they're aware, that the safety of innocent Palestinians is still of great concern. And so the actions they're taking must be consistent with attempting to do everything possible to prevent innocent Palestinian civilians from being hurt, murdered, killed, lost, etc.
Israel is losing international support over its indiscriminate bombings, Biden said during a campaign appearance earlier Tuesday, his sharpest public criticism. According to a White House transcript, he said Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu needs to change his coalition and empower the Palestinian Authority to become a partner in the peace process. He singled out Israel's far-right National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who opposes a two-state solution. Biden's comments came as 153 countries voted overwhelmingly in support of a UN resolution demanding a ceasefire. 10 countries opposed the measure, while 23 abstained.
Our duty is to try to save the lives who are still alive by having this resolution adopted and by forcing Israel to comply with it, and those who are shielding Israel to comply with the global consensus.
The vote followed a similar UN Security Council resolution Friday that failed due to a U.S. veto, a position that critics say damages Washington's interests beyond the Middle East.
But also where we are arguing, for example, in the United Nations to gain the support of the Global South for our condemnations, our just condemnations of Russia's abhorrent invasion of Ukraine. We are also going to lose votes if we are seen to be hypocritical, if we are seen to be walking away from our values.
General Assembly resolutions are non-binding but carry political weight.
UN officials, the majority of UN member states, are simply looking for every means possible to create a sense of moral pressure on the US to change its posture.
Israel and its supporters say a ceasefire will only benefit Hamas, allowing them to regroup for future attacks on Israel.
It's allowing Hamas to have a legitimacy that it hasn't earned. It's giving trust to terrorist leaders who have proven unequivocally that they are not trustworthy.
Following Hamas' October 7 attacks in Israel that killed at least 1,200, responding strikes by Israel in Gaza have killed more than 18,000 people by Palestinian count in the bloodiest campaign of the decades-long conflict. Patsy Widakuswara, VOA News.
Integral to the larger UN General Assembly vote for an immediate ceasefire Tuesday are calls for the immediate release of Israeli hostages still held by militants and demands that humanitarian groups have access to Palestinians trapped in the midst of a crisis. Negotiations for the safe return of hostages has been playing out in Qatar. Earlier I spoke with Joel Simon. He's the director of the Journalism Protection Initiative at the Craig Newmark School of Journalism here in New York and an expert in hostage policy. Joel, you recently wrote in The New Yorker about the hostage negotiations taking place with Israel and Hamas. It's hard to think of two more ideologically opposed groups. How do negotiations even work in those circumstances?
Well, I think the first thing to think about when you think about hostage taking and kidnapping, the groups that engage in this practice are obviously in a kind of deeply adversarial relationship with whoever the negotiating partner is. So it's always complicated to find some interlocutor who can bridge that gap. But the reality is that hostage crises are resolved through negotiation. So if you're going to reach a resolution, you need that kind of interlocutor. And in this instance, Qatar was able to play that role because it has a long-term relationship with Hamas. It's actually hosted Hamas's political office in Doha and has provided over $1 billion of aid to Gaza, which was done in coordination with the Israelis. So it also has a relationship with the Israelis, with the Israeli government, including hosting a trade office. And it's played this role, this historic role of sort of finding the common ground, particularly in hostage negotiations, but in other kinds of crises. And so it was well positioned to kind of mediate in this particular instance.
Thinking about sort of what drives hostage taking, you said Israel and Hamas, they both had things that they wanted from this situation. Right. What are some of like the common elements that groups are after? Is it the sort of the propaganda element that they can get, or is it the ransom, or sort of being able to negotiate with prisoners? What drives it?
So usually one side is much more powerful than the other side, and the other side feels that it can use hostage taking to secure a variety of different outcomes. Sometimes they're political objectives, sometimes they're sort of propaganda objectives, sometimes they're objectives in terms of financing. And remember that hostage taking is a tactic and a strategy used by all sorts of groups. Look, the one thing about hostage crises that I've learned in writing about them and reporting on them over many years is that each one is different, and that the lessons from the last conflict don't always apply to the current one. I mean, this is a unique situation in which, in terms of the Israeli objectives, they've made clear that freeing the hostages was an objective. Hamas also had taken hostages, so many hostages that they probably didn't need all of them to secure the strategic objectives that they were trying to achieve, and many of them were women and minors, and so I think they felt that they had some wiggle room to negotiate, and and they wanted certain things that the Israelis were able to offer. The Israelis wanted certain things, so they were able to find, even in the midst of conflict, and one as intense and frankly horrific as this one, some common grounds, and they had an effective interlocutor in the Qataris. So it was a kind of unique set of circumstances. I can't think of any other conflict where in an active conflict zone and with this number of hostages where you were able to find this kind of resolution.
Switching to Ukraine, the focus is on a US emergency spending bill that would provide additional aid, but remains stuck in Congress. From the capital, Kyiv, Anna Chernikova reports for VOA.
It's Ukraine's second Christmas season at war, and one filled with uncertainty for many here, as aid from the US remains in doubt. Since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, Ukraine has been almost completely dependent on military and financial support from its partners, especially the US. Vitaly Portnikov, a Ukrainian journalist and political analyst, says that the war has devastated Ukraine's economy, and that both the economy and the war effort depend on support from the West.
Ukraine cannot stop Russia's political ambitions. This can only be done with the West. With the support from the civilized world, Ukraine can defend its sovereignty and statehood, restore its economy, and not take help or loans from anyone. It's only a matter of time. But left on its own against Russia, Ukraine can simply collapse as a state. This is absolutely an objective reality.
As Ukraine's leadership works to persuade its friends to keep sending the support it needs, on the streets concern grows.
Of course, I count on some kind of support, because without it, objectively, we will not be able to win this war. I believe that every country should support Ukraine now, because we are an impassable barrier for Russia to the European countries at the moment.
Very difficult times are coming for Ukraine, and it will be very sad if all this turns in a completely different direction than we were already prepared for. We all need to rely on ourselves and always thank the world if it helps us.
As the US Senate prepares to vote on the aid package, many Ukrainians brace for what could be an especially uncertain new year. Anna Chernikova, VOA News, Kyiv.
Zelensky, alongside President Joe Biden, pleaded with US lawmakers to approve $61 billion in aid for his country's fight back against Russia's invasion. Without those funds, both say, a cold, grim winter looms. White House correspondent Anita Powell reports.
Well, Mr. President, welcome back.
The two presidents said the consequences are dire if Ukraine doesn't get the cash it needs to counter Russia's invasion as winter approaches. But the U.S. Congress, which signs the checks, is not yet convinced. Earlier Tuesday, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky urged lawmakers to pass President Joe Biden's $61 billion request by the end of the week. Republicans say they want to see proper oversight over the funding, and they also want to see a clear articulation of strategy. Biden vowed his continued support and said he wanted to see Ukraine win, and accused Republicans of playing into Moscow's hands by failing to pass the aid package.
This host of a Kremlin-run show said, "Well done, Republicans. That's good for us." That's a Russian speaking. If you're being celebrated by Russian propagandists, it might be time to rethink what you're doing. History will judge harshly those who turn their back on freedom's cause.
Zelensky continued to appeal for stronger air defenses and said his nation would not concede territory.
I have a question to these people if they are ready to give up their children to terrorists. I think no.
Russia's foreign ministry accused Zelensky of cadging, slang meaning to beg for something undeserved, and said he is an American puppet. U.S. taxpayers are showing signs of Ukraine fatigue, and some Republicans question why about a third of U.S. money goes not toward weapons, but government assistance. John Jameson, a mine-clearing campaigner who recently visited the country, said Ukraine needs every penny.
The deminers were working while we heard the sound of artillery going on. And they're doing that because they know it's essential for them to be able to start farming and producing and going back to work now so they can live, so they can not only just to fight the war, but so they can live. But no, we can't wait until the fighting's over.
But when will it end? Analysts say this may take more than a year and question whether Ukraine's supporters are funding it enough, considering how well this small army has done against a much larger foe.
They've become, in some ways, victims of their own success. So I think it's I don't think we should be so reasonably asking Ukrainians to do more, especially given the almost homeopathic nature of Western assistance. When you think about the amounts of munitions that are being delivered, about the minuscule amounts of ATACMS, of long-range artillery, precision artillery, air defenses, etc., that are being delivered to Ukraine, I think they are making a really impressive use of very limited resources that are given to them, provided to them against a much larger adversary.
It's now up to Congress to decide if Ukraine gets what they seek before the inevitable arrival of a cruel enemy that strikes without remorse. Winter. Anita Powell, VOA News, the White House.
Those reporting on the Israel-Hamas war or trying to offer assistance have not been spared the violence. In the first 2 months of the conflict, a record number of journalists and aid workers have been killed. VOA's Christina Caseda-Smith has the story.
The October 7 Hamas terror attack in southern Israel claimed the war's first media casualty. Yaniv Sohar, known for regularly being first on the scene for breaking news, had a long career with outlets including the Associated Press and an Israeli newspaper. Hamas killed the video journalist and his family. A few days later, a strike on the Lebanese border killed Reuters journalist Issam Abdallah and seriously injured several others. Analysis by Reuters and others says Israeli tank fire killed the video journalist. Findings showed the Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, knew the location of the news team. 2 shells were fired in quick succession, an apparent deliberate attack on civilians that could constitute a war crime, analysts say. IDF's international spokesman responded to the findings, saying Israel does not target journalists. Abdallah and Sohar are 2 of the more than 60 journalists killed in a conflict described by the Committee to Protect Journalists, or CPJ, as the deadliest on record. Their loss has an impact on audiences, say analysts.
Their work is really vital. We rely on journalists to be our eyes and ears in a conflict so that we know, as the international community, what is happening.
The conflict has killed thousands of civilians, including more than 130 United Nations relief workers. Outside the UN headquarters in New York, aid group Doctors Without Borders held a vigil to remember colleagues killed in Gaza. Given the loss of human life, the Secretary General has invoked Article 99 of the UN Charter.
Article 99 states, and I quote, that the Secretary General may bring to the attention of the Security Council any matter in his opinion that may threaten the maintenance of international peace and security.
With international media largely blocked from reporting inside Gaza, local journalists play a vital role.
It's clear that combatants on both sides will try and twist stories to their advantage. And having the more people we have reporting, the better we are likely to be able to get a balanced view in the fullness of time of exactly what's happening.
The number of journalists killed in the first 2 months of this war surpasses that of wars in Iraq, where CPJ data shows 32 killed in all of 2006, and Syria, where 31 cases were documented in 2012. Watchdogs are calling for accountability.
It's really important for us to document every single case of a journalist killed, because we want to ensure that those killings and those deaths are investigated and those who are responsible are held accountable.
As the temporary ceasefire to release hostages and prisoners ends and Israel resumes fighting Hamas inside Gaza, analysts predict the toll for civilians, aid workers, and the journalists trying to tell their stories will rise. Cristina Caicedo-Smith, VOA News.
Here in the US, some of our top-tier universities and their presidents have drawn criticism, including from Congress, after accusations they failed to stop anti-Semitism and Islamophobia on campus. Our Robin Guest reports.
At Penn, does calling for the genocide of Jews violate Penn's rules or code of conduct? Yes or no?
A contentious congressional hearing about reports of anti-Semitism at Harvard University, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania ended with Republican Congresswoman from New York, Elise Stefanik, calling for resignations of the school's presidents, accusing them of not protecting students.
In response, I have sought to confront hate while preserving free expression. This is difficult work, and I know that I have not always gotten it right.
And this is why you should resign. These are unacceptable answers across the board.
Penn's Liz McGill, Harvard's Claudine Gay, and MIT's Sally Kornbluth all defended decisions that allowed protest on campus. But critics said they equivocated over whether protests calling for the genocide of Jews would violate school policies. McGill resigned December 9th amid the firestorm.
They're incredibly qualified in the academic world. They are not qualified to lead universities. There's an absence of good leadership. She's absolutely spot on. 1 down, 2 to go.
But others defended their leadership and said Congress is not the place for picking university leaders.
That's completely outrageous. The idea that a sitting congresswoman feels it's her responsibility or that she's entitled to determine who runs a university is outrageous. This is completely counterproductive. This American higher education is the envy of the world. It's globally preeminent because of our robust protection of academic freedom.
Days after the hearing, Harvard's and MIT's governing boards backed their leaders, although some donors to the schools continue to criticize their decision. On college campuses, many professors consider the protest teachable moments.
I think that one of the things that we're really missing out on here is an opportunity to teach students civil discourse. You know, how do we sit down and talk to each other when we don't agree with each other, when we might not even like each other?
The U.S. Department of Education is investigating at least a dozen schools for anti-Semitism violations. Some professors say the spotlight on campuses is an opportunity for vigorous debate about anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and the First Amendment protections for free speech and protest.
I'd much rather college presidents, and boards actually focus on these issues rather than how we're going to beat up a college president for a bad soundbite in a congressional hearing. That's not important. I understand why some people see it symbolically important, but it's not as important as how we're going to use our educational resources to turn out a next generation of critical thinkers on difficult issues like this.
The U.S. has more than 4,000 college and university campuses. Not all, or even most, are accused of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. Some academics say the current climate is creating a chilling effect on free speech and academic freedom. Robin Guess, VOA News.
Thank you for being with us. You can stay up to date with all of the news at voanews.com. Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at VOA News, and you can follow me on X at Jessica Jareed. Catch up on our past episodes on the free streaming service VOA+. For all of those behind the scenes who brought you today's show, I'm Jessica Drew. We'll see you next week for The Inside Story.